Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, the Gospels of the New Testament. We are looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus, and we're doing this chronologically, looking at the best we can, the best that we can see that it's in chronological order. And today we're looking at Jesus easing John's doubts, and this comes from Matthew 11, verses 1 through 19, and Luke 7, 18 through 35. And I'm really not going to, I've been trying to read as much as I can on these, but these are pretty long sections, and so I'm going to encourage you to take the time to read these and go through them, and then I'm gonna hit the key points here with this, and basically the key thing to look at here is John is in prison, right? He was we already looked at that. He was put in prison by Herod because Herod married his own sister-in-law, right? And then John publicly rebuked him for it, and so he was thrown in prison. And so basically you have some of John's disciples coming to Jesus, disciples and Jesus, and asking him, "Hey, are you the Messiah that we were promised?" And you got to understand from John's perspective, he's done everything he's supposed to do. Right? He's fulfilled, his role and his mission, excuse me, of keeping, bringing Jesus, or being the messenger about Jesus coming into this world, and now he's sitting in prison. He's sitting in prison for doing what he's supposed to be doing, standing up for what is right. And unfortunately, many times when you stand up for what is right, you're going to be persecuted for it. That's just the way this world works. And so, you know, so John here is questioning. He's like, he's sitting in prison. He's like, "Hey, what's going on? Are you really the Messiah?" And so that's the question, right? If Jesus really was the Messiah, then why is John in prison when he could have been preaching to the crowds, right? He could have been out there preparing people for their hearts. And this is the hard thing, right? Jesus never really answers his question about, or never really mentions or talks about why John the Baptist was in prison. Why did God allow him to be in prison? And eventually we're going to find out that he's killed, right? And so it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to say. It's like, look, he did the work of Jesus. He did the mission. He did what he was supposed to be called to do, and he was killed for it. While Jesus was walking around, I mean, Jesus could have gone and got him out. I mean, Jesus had the power to go and get him out. And so we just see, and so he asked him, and it's like his disciples asked him, "Are you the Messiah?" And he's like, "Look, you know, do you see these things happening? Right? Are people being healed? Are the lame walking? Right? Are did their dead rise again, and that kind of stuff?" And he's like, he never really even says he's Messiah. He's like, look at the signs. Look at the signs of what's happening. And so this is the thing. It says Jesus answered John's doubts by pointing to the acts of healing the blind, lame, and the deaf, curing lepers, right, raising the dead, and preaching the good news to the poor. With so much evidence, Jesus identity with all that, he didn't have to say, "Yeah, go tell him I am," right? And like I said, there's very few times where he actually says that he is God or that he's the Messiah. He kind of he uses this method of letting people figure it out for themselves. Like, look around what's happening. You don't see anyone else doing this kind of stuff. And so he that's his answer. That's his answer to John. There's nothing more. It's like, look around, see what's happening, and go back and report it to him. And so he goes on to say some really nice things, especially in Luke. If you look at Luke, he talks about whenever John's disciples leave, he looks to the crowds and says, "What kind of man did you go in the wilderness to see?" And he goes in and talks about these things, and he says in verse 28 of Luke 7, he says, "I tell you, all who have ever lived, none is greater than John." Right? I mean, he is talking about John in an unreal way. I mean, Jesus and God Himself saying that none is greater. But then he says this, and he says, "Yet even the least person in the kingdom of God is greater than he is." And so he's contrasting that what it's like to be in the kingdom of God. And so no person, right? No person has ever fulfilled his God-given purpose better than John. No one has. I mean, and God, Jesus, in fact, mentions how wonderful John was, right? But in the kingdom, right? In the kingdom, in the church, all members will have a greater spiritual heritage than John has, because they will have seen and known Christ and finished the work of his finished work of the cross. John didn't get to see that. John doesn't get to see the work that he started. It's unfortunate. Like my human side is like, that's unfair. That's not right. And I know we look at it from a human perspective. Once John was in heaven, I really don't think he was complaining, right? And so I think on earth he was a little frustrated. He had to be frustrated. He had to be frustrated, but of being, it's like, look, I'm doing God's will. I'm doing what you asked me to do, and now I'm being thrown in prison for it. And that's what we have to understand, right? I always say this, right? Part of what our motto is to simply be the church and to make it simple, because being a Christian is simple, but it's not easy. And that's the thing we've got to, we've added all these things. We made being a Christian complicated when it shouldn't be, right? But being a Christian is hard, right? And what John was doing was hard, and we don't understand. Like, we go through things and things happen and we don't understand them, and it can sometimes cause us to want to give up. I've been there, right? I've seen people who have done horrible things in the name of Christ, but yet they still seem to be able to move forward. And it's like, and you wonder, like, God, why are you allowing this? Why do you allow these things to happen, right? And I don't get it, and I never will understand it. And maybe one day when I'm in heaven, I'll understand it. But God has a way of working things out. He has a way of making things happen, and this was his plan, right? This was his plan, and for whatever reason, he allowed John to be in prison and eventually be killed. And that, he was the messenger for Christ. Why that happened, and some people may say, well, that's not right, that's not fair. You know, we don't know what God was doing. We don't know why God was doing. And I try not to, I not say I won't. I do question God all the time, like, why are you doing this? But in the end, it's like I understand that He knows better. He knows better. He's infinitely, I think I know better, but I don't. And so that's where we've got to understand. Like, and that's the other thing too, is there's nothing wrong with having doubt. This is another thing that we I've seen so many times in the church where kids will ask a question, or I've seen it in Bible classes and stuff like that. It's like, well, you're not allowed to doubt. If you don't have doubt, you don't have faith. And it's like, you're not allowed to ask the hard questions. There's so many times that this is done. I'm the opposite way. I want you to ask the hard questions. I may not know the answer. And there's a lot of things that we don't know the answer to. We really don't. If we're being honest, we don't know the answer. It's a best guess. There's a lot of scripture and a lot of things where it's a best guess, right? And we take it and we're like, oh, well, this is absolutely what it says 100%. No, we don't. We don't know. And so we don't need to be arguing about stuff like that. But and that's where to get back to my point is, we need to allow people to ask hard questions, ask really hard questions. But we don't do that. We always try to. I'll say we always. I shouldn't say that, but many times what we do is like, well, if you question things or you doubt things, then you're not having strong enough faith. No, John the Baptist was questioning, right? Look at that. And so we need to be able to, safely ask questions. And I think this is one of the biggest problems. One of the largest problems we're seeing in the church is people aren't allowed to ask questions. That's why one of the things we do, right? One of the things we do is our worship service. Part of it's not me preaching. It's not me. I try to help facilitate, and I do end up probably talking more than anyone else. But it's a free space to open the hard or open to ask the hard questions, right? And it's not, in a lot of these, it's not a, well, put this down and no, we ask that we dig deep into the hard questions. We ask the hard things, right? But then we can agree to disagree. And that's what we should be doing. That's what we should be doing. As a church, we should be allowed to ask these hard questions and dive deep into them. And we shouldn't just stick to, well, this is what we've always taught. This is what we've always done. And so this is the way it's going to be. That's why people are leaving the church, because they see how unauthentic it is, right? Because that's not authentic. That's not being open to studying the scriptures. That's, well, this person decided this 150 years ago, 200 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 600 years ago, whatever theology you stand behind. And so that's what it's going to be. And no questions. You can't question it, and you can't do it. It's like, well, then no, then that's not authentic. That's not an authentic faith. I'm sticking to tradition and hoping that me checking these boxes is going to get me to heaven. And so we need to understand John the Baptist here is doubting what's going on. He's questioning, are you who you say you are? And we should be allowed to ask that same question, right? Now, we want to be careful with it. We don't want to dive off into a, But I think that's part of the problem too, is if we're not allowed to ask the questions or we're not really getting real answers, then why would you stick around? Because then it's like, well, that's not, if Jesus hadn't answered him or be like, oh, John, you're not allowed to ask that question, right? Or got on to him for asking that question. That's the other thing, is like people ask serious questions sometimes, or questions of doubt, and we get on to them. We chastise them for not having enough faith, and we got to stop doing that kind of stuff. Man, we need to have open discussion, open dialogue in our churches, and be able to ask the hard questions, and then we have to, as church leaders, need to admit that we don't know sometimes, right? That we don't know, that we have no clue, right? Or we have a good guess of what this might mean, or what this might, and leave it at that. And because when we sit there and say we know for sure about something that we don't know, then we look like, one, we're lying, or we're just being we're trying to deceive. And so that's where we need to get into that and say, hey, this is what we think, right? This is the best answer we have for this situation, not I'm 100% right and everyone else is wrong. We've got to get away with that. And I'm sorry I went on a little tangent there, tangent there, but I want people to understand that these are serious things that we dismiss and we don't allow, and we need to allow the questions. I mean, and especially if you're working with the youth, you've got to let the youth ask hard questions. Let them ask the hard questions. Let them talk to you about things. Let them doubt. Let them have doubts. But show them answers. Show them ways. Don't sit there and chastise them because they ask questions or they doubt things, right? Or don't believe things. That's not the way. Show them why we believe it. Show them, hey, this is a good direction to go, or encourage them to ask questions and have doubts. So there's nothing wrong with that. Again, I'm sorry I went on that for a little longer, but it's very important. It's a very, very important thing in the church that we need to start out and not just try to gatekeep everything and like, well, this is what we believe and you have to believe this and you can't question this stuff. I would walk away from that. And so we got to allow we've got to allow people in there and not gatekeep these hard things, these hard questions, and keep people away from them. And we actually need to sit down and study them, because I'm telling you, that's one of the things that was most transforming for me was probably 8-10 years ago now. I started sitting down and I started studying, just like before it's like, oh, this is what we believe and I'm always going to believe this, and if anyone else questions this, well, then they're wrong. But then I started sitting down and I started actually studying it, and I started looking at at other sources, and I started looking at the Bible as a whole and not just cherry picking a couple verses. And the Bible really opens up and really there's just a huge difference when you start doing that and really study the Bible and not just stick to your specific context, right? It's like, oh, well, we can only study people who's part of my group. We can only study, if you're not allowed to read books from people outside your group, you're not allowed to study, or learn from people outside your group. You've got to, well, then you just create a echo chamber of nothing but the same ideas, and nothing's questions, nothing's, and that's not the way to do it. You've got to get in there and ask the questions. You've got to be able to allow to have doubts. You've got to be able to research, and you've got to look down. And again, I'm sorry I went on that one, but it's so important, and it's so important for so many churches today that we get into that and we allow that. So back to what John was. So John was functioning, or he was the last, right, to function as the Old Testament like prophet model that we had seen, right? He's the last one to do that, and he was the one who prepared for the coming of Jesus, right? For Christianity, for Jesus and him, he prepared that. And so the other thing we need to look at, for when he says that John, there's none greater than John, yet even the least person in the kingdom of God is greater than he. He's not trying to contrast John and Christians like, oh, well, they're Pentecostals. He's using that as an example, right? He was using that to contrast what life was like before Christ and what life's going to be like in the fullness of the kingdom. And then that's what he's doing there. Some other things to look at, Matthew 11:14, it says, there's a lot of people that said John was the resurrection of Elijah. But no, he just took Elijah's role, that prophetic role that he took. He boldly confronted sin, right? Pointing to God. That's what he was doing there. And in Matthew 11:16-19, Jesus condemns the attitude of his generation. No matter what he said, no matter what he did, they took the opposite view. And I've seen that kind of stuff. Like, people are so close-hearted, like so close-minded, that even if you're the one who suggests something, they're going to deny, like they're just going to ignore it or pretend it or go the opposite direction. I mean, it's wild that people will close their mind off so much of that, right? They were cynical, they were skeptical because he challenged their comfortable. He challenged their comfort zone. He you know, they had these lives that had power. And I'm telling you, you challenge people's positions of power more than anything, right? It doesn't matter where they're, it doesn't matter if they're in the church, it doesn't matter if they're in business, it doesn't matter. If people are in love with the power that they have, right? If that's their main goal, is to be in a position of authority and position of power. When you challenge that position, when you challenge that, they're going to come back at you. Doesn't matter, right? And that's what the Pharisees were. They were wrong. They were in the wrong. Like they saw this man raising people from the dead, and they still refused because they would have had to have given up their power. And we've seen that, man. We see that so many times where people like they will go down, you know, just so they can keep their power, and they'll do things even as people who call themselves Christians and claim to be Christians will do things just to keep positions of power. And it's unfortunate that we see that in the church, right? And so and the end of that says we justify our inconsistencies because listening to God may require us to change the way we live. And that's the key thing is listening to God so many times requires us to change the way we live. And as Christians, right, who've gotten like a lot of us who've gotten bogged down in traditionalism, right, or legalism and things like that, right? When you start opening your mind to and looking at what Jesus really taught, right? He wasn't about those kind of things. And that's hard because when you've been raised in that, it's hard to pull yourself out of it. And it's hard to say, oh, well, maybe we're wrong. Because when we look and study what God did and what Jesus did and what he taught, right, that's going to require us to change a lot of the ways we do things now. And it's hard. It's not easy. I can tell you there's times where, like, when we would say, hey, you know, this isn't really something biblical. This is a tradition. And we'd start doing something else. I'd be like, it felt so weird. It was so weird. And it was like, it's like, you know, but then after a couple of times, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is fine, you know? And so, and again, I'm talking about things that aren't biblical. I'm talking about things that we've made traditions, legalism type stuff, and that's what I'm talking about. And so, anyways, I thought this was going to be a shorter one, but you know, these type of things just hit on me, and they're very important, especially the idea around doubt. It's just so important that we allow, especially our young people, but even the adults, even the older adults, right, in our churches, to be able to have doubts and question things and challenge them. Right? It's how you grow. It's truly how you grow. As always, I appreciate y'all for watching these and following all the way through them. If you think this is something that could be beneficial or help someone, you know, please share it. And as always, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please go and do so. And as always, I thank you for watching.